As I speak to you right now, people across Afghanistan, children, women, men, people young and old, are starving to death, freezing to death, clinging to bare life because of policies that were imposed when the Taliban took power after 20 years of war. These policies are expected to kill 4 times more Afghans than estimated to have died during the entire 2 decades-long conflict. Who is in charge of these policies? The United States. I co-founded one of Afghanistan's largest women's organizations and have worked for over 20 years on girls' education, women's rights, and protection of women and families from violence. We were devastated when the Taliban took over and feared for women's rights. Right now, US policy is causing a crisis that could be far worse than anything the Taliban has done. The American government is causing an unprecedented famine on the innocent people of Afghanistan, which was already one of the world's poorest countries. Afghans are experiencing the single most devastating year in their recorded history. 23 million Afghans, a majority of the country's population of nearly 40 million people, are suffering from extreme levels of hunger. The World Food Programme has called it hell on earth. But this is not simply a humanitarian disaster. This is not just a tragedy or a misfortune. No. What is happening in Afghanistan today is happening because of policy decisions made in Washington, D.C. In 2021, as the US withdrew from its war in Afghanistan, the government that it was supporting collapsed, and the country was swept by the forces of the Taliban, the enemy the United States had been fighting for 20 years. But instead of finally leaving Afghanistan to decide its own destiny, the United States continues to wage war in Afghanistan of a different kind: economic war. United States policy is devastating the entire country and bringing further pain to tens of millions of Afghan civilians. America and its allies cut all the money they had been pumping into Afghanistan for 20 years, on which the economy had come to totally rely. 75% of the government's budget disappeared overnight. The World Bank halted funding that supported the education sector and 2/3 of the country's health centers. Then, sanctions that were placed on the Taliban were applied to the new Afghan government as it was taking power, exiling the country from the international economy. And the last part of it was the most devastating of all. The American government decided to freeze Afghanistan's central bank holdings, nearly $10 billion that belonged to the Afghan people. What happens when you confiscate the financial reserves of an impoverished country? Inflation spikes, making food unaffordable for millions. Businesses close down and banks can't function, cutting access to income for Afghan working families. Eventually, the entire financial system collapses. And that is exactly what is happening. The Afghan economy is collapsing in rapid fashion. Experts say it is one of the fastest economic contractions in recorded history. In just a few months, one of the poorest countries in the world is facing a faster economic decline than the US saw over years during the Great Depression. The United States and its allies had built an Afghan economy totally dependent on their resources and aid. And then they cut that, taking it away overnight. And on top of that, confiscated all of the country's central bank reserves. Today, the jobs that the occupation had provided are gone. Afghans with bank accounts can only access a small portion of their money. All this in the middle of a global pandemic. And while they're experiencing their worst drought in 35 years. Afghans have been plunged into a new level of desperation. In the unequivocal words of Dr. Paul Spiegel, professor of public health at Johns Hopkins, returning from a visit to Afghanistan, I can clearly state that if the United States and other Western governments do not change their Afghanistan sanction policies, more Afghans will die from sanctions than at the hands of the Taliban. Ultimately, only the US government wields the power to alleviate this crisis. The United States says that it cares about Afghanistan. America supplies more aid to Afghanistan than any other country. But these donations do not come close to offsetting the damage that US policy is causing the Afghan people by crippling their entire society. People monitoring the situation are clear that aid alone will not create a stable economy, and that Afghanistan needs to have commerce and a functioning banking system. After 43 years of conflict, Afghans deserve to rebuild their lives. They deserve post-conflict reconstruction and to build a sustainable economy that is connected to the world. Instead, we're holding them back and making them remain dependent on aid. Not only is this not right, but it is not in America's best interest. In the words of the president of the International Rescue Committee, a charity working in Afghanistan, the economy is not just in free fall, it's being strangled. We want to say loud and clear that you can't solve this problem of mass malnutrition only with a humanitarian effort. Jan Egeland, the head of the Norwegian Refugee Council, says, "It is now, paradoxically, the Western sanctions that is our main problem in saving lives in Afghanistan. This policy can be ended at any time. Officials within the Biden administration could protect millions of Afghans from starvation and death. The Afghan people's hopes lie with officials like National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, Deputy Treasury Secretary Wally Adeyemo, and of course, President Joe Biden himself. They can end this policy right now, unfreeze the central bank reserves, and allow the Afghan people to recover from decades of war. These officials understand the value of helping working families, of protecting our children, and ensuring that they are given the opportunity to survive. But we need them to see that Afghanistan's children are just as deserving of life as children in America." The best way to address this tragedy, to stop the wave of starvation and death, is to end the sanctions we have placed on the country and give back the money that we have seized. The Afghan Central Bank was designed by Americans, and the Taliban have not changed the law. As experts have pointed out, it is an independent and technocratic institution with transparent financial flows. I appeal to you to listen, to act. Let's not cause an entire nation to experience extreme harm under our watch. America's leaders can stop this, but they must act as quickly as possible. Let's end these harmful sanctions. Let's accept that the war is over. I'm Masuda Sultan from Unfreeze Afghanistan for the Gravel Institute.